And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Mal Chadwick. Mal is the web editor at Greenpeace who we work with on their Google Ads grant account. And he's going to talk you through today how the charity balances their sustainable marketing practices in line with their values and mission. Over to you, Mal.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Mal. I've been working for Greenpeace for about 5 years now. I came in originally as a digital campaigner, which basically means you work on one campaign at a time and do all of the digital outputs on multiple platforms. So that means I worked on everything from tuna to nuclear power to oil drilling to whaling, a whole range of different things. And then last year, in fact, on the day that the UK first went into lockdown, I went into a new role as website editor, which is basically the opposite. So I now work on multiple campaigns and projects, but on a single platform, which, yeah, it means, I suppose, I've got a good sort of overview of how Greenpeace sort of runs its communications and the kinds of challenges that we run into. Just bear with me 1 second, sorry. Yeah, so obviously Greenpeace is sort of the definition of a purpose-driven brand. It was set up originally to oppose a nuclear test and then evolved into a kind of organization advocating for environment and peace all over the world. And so I suppose you might think that doing communications there, that the organization's values and its purpose would naturally shine through in the work itself. You know, we're choosing our project for our purpose. And that's definitely true to an extent. But I think as all of the recent controversies around Facebook and any number of other bits of news that you could choose have sort of re-highlighted, the practice of mass communication, it has its own ethical pitfalls that are just inherent in what we're doing. And so in order to be true to our values and to sort of honor those in our communications, we're trying to navigate those pitfalls with integrity. And of course, we're trying to do that without compromising our impact as well, which I guess in the commercial space, as Alex was saying, that's also the ability to be able to profit alongside pursuing your purpose. So we're rightly held to a high standard by the public and by our supporters. And so over time, we've developed a few principles, I suppose, that guide our marketing work. So we're by no means perfect on any of these measures, but they're kind of a touch point, I suppose. They're an expression of our best instincts, first of all, and also sort of measure that we use to hold ourselves accountable and also to each other. Frankie, would you be able to just advance a couple of slides for me? Brilliant. So yeah, honoring our values in the practice as well as the content of communication. So first of all, we're thinking about framing. So when we're first picking up a campaign, when we're looking at a new issue, we have to make the decision, a whole set of decisions on how we're going to define it. Who are the main characters? Who are the heroes and the villains? Who's the supporting cast? What's the nature of the problem? What do the solutions look like? All of those kinds of things. They're really important in the effectiveness of our marketing, but also in the sort of integrity with which we're pursuing it. So in the environmental space, often what this can come down to is whether you're putting humans or wildlife at the forefront of your campaign. Obviously, animals and nature don't have the same sort of political baggage and complexity as human communities and human lives. Animals don't mind how they're being portrayed. They don't have anything particular to say about it. And of course, that's not true of people. We have different sorts of obligations to them. And so often it's simpler to construct a campaign around a habitat or a species of whales and things like that. It's obviously lots of what Greenpeace is known for. But what you can end up doing there is actually erasing the human element of these places and of these things that we're trying to protect. And of course, lots of the kind of basis of the environmental movement is preserving a place that is nice and peaceful for humans to live in. So a really good example of this is actually the Amazon rainforest. So lots and lots of campaigning, including lots of Greenpeace campaigning historically, if you just looked at that, you might think it was just a sort of deserted forest full of animals and plants and wildlife, but not really many people. It's about 1 million people live in the Amazon rainforest. And so when we were doing our campaign on the what we call the Amazon Reef, which was a coral reef just off the coast of the mouth of the Amazon River, we could just get the next slide. We really tried to emphasize the fact that there's human communities all through these areas, and we tried to show what makes those places rich and beautiful and special. So we found that actually along that coast, which would have been completely devastated by an oil spill, there were communities that had actually been founded by people who'd escaped the slave trade in the 17th and 18th century. So they're trying to make those people in those communities feel a bit more real and three-dimensional, as well as just emphasizing the animals. So making sure that that's kind of coming to the fore, and we're not just implying that these places are deserted and that people from outside can do whatever they want to them. Really important. If we could go forward again. The next one we try to think about is around the idea of taking credit and giving credit and sharing credit. So when we pick up a new campaign for the first time, usually by the time it comes onto our radar, there's going to have been people locally, there's going to be grassroots campaigners and local people who have been working on this stuff for years with very little recognition, very little exposure, no glory. And there's a tendency, again, historically, with organizations that are coming in and trying to do good, especially larger ones with a bit more name recognition, like Greenpeace, to sort of try to act like the cavalry and to sort of sweep in and act like we're the first people ever to have discovered that this is a problem and that we've got all the answers and all the solutions. And that's never really the case. So a good example of this is in the fracking campaign. We just go forwards. Yeah, sorry, Frankie, I'm not able to actually control the slides from here, unfortunately. Let's see. Got it now. Okay, great. I think that's working now. I don't know if people remember, it was kind of a few years ago now, and you don't hear much about it these days because the campaign was pretty successful. But there was a real threat that the big fracking industry was going to take off in the UK. And there was a really energetic and powerful local campaign, particularly in Lancashire, to oppose that. And I think after a slightly shaky start with this, I think we realized that the way to do this most effectively was going to be to work with those people to kind of elevate their struggle and make sure that they were sort of the heroes of the story, and also to highlight the fact that they really knew their area and they really cared about it. So kind of showing that there's valuable experience and knowledge everywhere, not succumbing to sort of saviorism, I suppose. And also that the best and most sort of lasting sustainable victories often arise from that kind of collaboration. So next up, it's just, sometimes I can change the slide and sometimes I can't. Sorry about this. Frankie, if you could advance it for me, sorry. Thank you. So next up, I've called this Foundations, which is a bit of an awkward name, but it's basically around the idea that there are certain ideas and institutions and just beliefs about the world that we really depend on people having in order for us to be able to do our work effectively. So, for example, we're always talking about how we need to change the way that things work, and we need to get companies to introduce better practices, and we need governments to introduce better policies. And all of that relies on a belief that companies will occasionally change their practices and governments will change their policies, and they'll do that in response to ordinary people campaigning and advocating for that being the right thing. As soon as people stop believing that, then we're kind of dead in the water. But I think sometimes it can be easy to actually slowly erode those beliefs through the way that we communicate. So if you're talking about if you're highlighting lots of kind of hypocrisy and bad faith stuff from politicians, do you end up creating a belief that actually, well, they're all the same, they're all corrupt, nothing can ever change, it's not worth bothering with? So we call it like trying to foster like skepticism without cynicism, so we can hold people to account while still emphasizing the fact that there is the possibility of change and that there are I think importantly that there are good people working within these systems to try and improve them, and that like a big part of our job is actually to strengthen their hand. So if you can go to the next slide. This is just something that a really short bit of text of how we try and communicate this for kind of international negotiations for an oceans campaign. So we're trying to emphasize the fact that there are politicians that are pushing for change and are not progressing as far as they want to because they can't, there's sort of forces against them, and making sure that we're showing that those people exist and that it's a kind of complex reality within the halls of power, and that we can influence those people and ideally try to help them. So celebrating the wins and emphasizing the good guys as well as the people who are doing the bad stuff. So next up, if you could just advance the slide, Frankie, it's accessibility. So this one's a little bit of an outlier because it's got some technical aspects to it and also some editorial, I suppose. But I think it's really interesting in the context of the age of climate change, because of course, when we're thinking about creating accessible communications, often we're thinking about disabled people, we're thinking about neurodiverse people. We might even be thinking about the person who is trying to get on the bus with 3 bags of shopping and a cracked phone screen, right? Trying to make sure that our communications work well for people in those real world kind of messy situations. But within the kind of environmental lens as well, we've also started thinking about how do we communicate effectively to people who are suffering from climate anxiety that's genuinely affecting their mental health, or to people who've been in some kind of like trauma as a result of a natural disaster that's been driven by climate change. So that might be very much like in the moment of, you know, there's just been a hurricane or a flood or something like that, and the internet connection is terrible. And so we might need like a low data version of our communications. Or we just might need to be sensitive about the way that we're talking about things like the experiences of flooding. And again, balancing that with impact and being compelling is a real challenge. I think one thing that we've found helps us with this is building a more diverse team and making sure that that team, which I hasten to say I do not represent, but luckily there are other people in the organization with a bit more of a range of life experience than me, but making sure that also that team is empowered to speak up and to challenge people in senior positions if there's something that we're missing, because you know no one can connect with everything, but making sure that if someone can say, well, actually that doesn't really match my life experience, or what about these people who've been through this, then kind of having that openness and that curiosity about how people engage with your work in the real world can really help. Oh yeah, and a quick example, actually, this is an example of where we got this wrong recently. If you just correct to the next slide. We released a video showing the links between Tesco, the supermarket, and the deforestation of the Amazon, basically, and how they were buying meat from companies that were clearing the Amazon for animal feed. This video was all animation. It was trying to sort of visualize quite a sort of dry technical concept of how supply chains work. And we realized in response to some feedback from a supporter that if you had a visual impairment and you were relying on a screen reader, there was really no way for the message of this video to come across, because there's no speech in it, so there's no subtitles or any captions. And we didn't do a description or audio description or anything. So that's where we're getting it wrong. And we're trying to build in some stuff in the process of the design of our videos and the kind of challenges that we put to agencies to make sure that we're building those considerations in from the very start. So next slide. This one's sort of connected to the point about sharing credit, but it's also when we are representing other people, we're either telling their stories or giving them a chance to tell their own stories, that we're doing that with integrity. So again, it can be easy to be exploitative or tokenistic when you're representing other people, doing case studies and stories, even though they can be really powerful. And one way that we've sort of found really works well to kind of get around that, and also leads to more effective communications, is to build proper relationships over the long term, rather than trying to rope people in at the very last minute. So the kinds of like pitfalls that we might encounter there are like, if we're trying to highlight the impacts of climate change, I think it's very easy to depict the people who are affected by climate change, particularly in poorer countries, as just being victims without any agency. and that things are just happening to them and it's up to us to save them. And obviously that narrative is both unhelpful and also false, because often the people in those places are the ones that are fighting the hardest for their own survival. And we need to make sure that we're representing that and telling those stories, as well as showing what's at risk. So in the next slide, this is actually a really helpfully recent example. So on Monday, we sailed up the River Clyde on our ship, the Rainbow Warrior, with 4 activists from the Youth Climate Strike movement, who all represent countries from the most affected countries by climate change. So we have people on from Namibia, Uganda, Mexico and Bangladesh in this case. And we really made these guys the focus of the story. We'd worked with them for several months in advance, and we've been working with the climate strike movement for much longer to try to make sure that we can pretty much get to the point where we can sort of pass over the microphone to them and allow them to tell their story and give them literally a platform in the form of our ship to get their message across. And the kind of the sort of trust and rapport that we've built up over time means that we were able to do that, I think, really effectively and slightly change the normal narrative that you get around the global climate negotiations. So next up, final slide. This is, again, another one which kind of has, I guess, technical and editorial implications, but this is really around the platforms that we rely on to get our message out there. So particularly sort of email and social media, I think, are the strongest examples of this. How are we making sure that those platforms, we're doing whatever we can do to make sure that those platforms are healthy? So good examples of where this can sort of fall down is in, for example, email. If you're sending out 15 emails a week and they've all got incredibly urgent, scary subject lines, then eventually, if people are getting that from 10 other organizations and a bunch of online shops at the same time, they're just going to give up on their inbox eventually. And then we've then lost the ability to communicate via email through those people. So, and then likewise with social media, obviously it's a huge ecosystem, and there's only so much that we can do as a single organization to influence the direction it goes, but trying to make sure that we're not polluting the well that we're drinking from, and in particular making sure that the subject lines that we're putting through aren't and the messages that we're putting through aren't actively making people dread opening their inbox. One thing that we saw a lot, particularly around the sort of early months of the pandemic, were subject lines that were from other organizations, I hasten to say, from subject lines that would read like they were from a bank or a business that implied that you were in some sort of financial trouble, or that read like they were from a friend who was angry with you, that you'd done something wrong. So it was things like, "We need to talk," or "about your account," and stuff like that. And as you might expect, those emails get incredibly high open rates because everyone goes, "Oh my God, what's this? I need to check right now." And then they find, it's an email about a sale or signing a petition or whatever. So making sure we're trying to avoid those sorts of things, and sort of just doing our part to make sure that all the work we've put in to build up, an audience on email and on social media doesn't end up being thrown away as those platforms become sort of unusable. So actually, I guess the way to think about that really is that we're bringing a sort of a sustainability or a resource management lens to our behavior on those platforms, and making sure in particular that the incentives that we've got don't drive people, the kind of individual content creators, to do unethical things in pursuit of, trying to get ever increasing open rates and stuff like that. So those are my six principles, and I think sort of grappling with these over time has been really, really difficult, but also really fun. I think part of what makes marketing and communications such a great field to work in is that you're constantly doing creative problem solving, and adding the ethical dimension and those sorts of imperatives mean that you've got lots more kinds of problems to solve and the opportunity to potentially do something new. Because if for example, all of the stories and narratives that we've been given since we were kids are all about individual heroes coming in and saving the day, and we've got an opportunity to build a narrative about a group of people collaborating to make the world better, then that's really exciting. It's a big opportunity. So yeah, it's a privilege to be able to work in this way, but it's all very much a work in progress. So yeah, if you've got any suggestions or examples, things that you think are really powerful, then please do reach out, because it'd be great to hear from you guys. There's so much interesting work going on in the agency world, so let's please keep the conversation going. That's everything I've